Professor Richard Wolff, it is so nice to see you.
Great to be here.
So I think we'll just jump right into the heart of the matter, which is, I'm curious your perspective on if you see Trump's trade war as a sort of seminal turning point event in America's long-term empire decline.
Well, the short answer is absolutely yes. That's what I do. I see what Mr. Trump is doing. I do take it seriously. He has economic advisors. There is an idea there about the situation, and there's a bit of a plan of what to do with it. But the word I would use, the adjective that comes most to my mind, is desperation. And I think
Mm.
the world is looking at this that way, that these are the acts of people who have become desperate. And otherwise, you wouldn't do this. I mean, take a step back. We have just declared trade war by imposing tariffs on the whole world.
Mm.
Nobody does that. Nobody's doing that now. We are the only. China isn't doing that. Russia's not doing that. No European country is doing. That's an incredible thing to do. And yes, the United States is a big player in the world economy, even now, no question. But its relative position has been declining now for quite some time. In a way, it was in the cards. We came out of World War II, the top country, every other potential competitor had been wiped out by the war. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, you name it, they were in ruins. And we were it. And anybody who has any historical sense would have known that that's not a sustainable situation, that the countries that were ruined are going to try to rebuild. And the United States is going to be the target, the measure. If you want to make it back into the world power, you're going to have to do as well or better than the United States because it's sitting at the top of the hill. And first, the Germans and the Japanese did it to a considerable extent. And then, and this was a surprise for the West anyway, the Chinese have done it.
Mm-hmm.
The Chinese have done it way more and way faster than anyone else ever did. This is not a question of liking China or not. China has its problems like every other country. I'm not here celebrating it, but I'm not going to play. I'm a professional economist. I look at every piece of evidence I can get, and the United States has now a problem. And it's a problem we have not had as a nation for 100 years. Whatever our internal problems, the inequality that we have, which is very serious, the leftover problems of racism, all of that. I mean, you know that, you talk about it, we all know it unless we have a ideological need to pretend that it isn't there. But what is really new is for the first time in a century, we have a real, serious economic competitor. I like to give a couple of statistics when I explain this to my audiences here. The United States GDP, which is that number, a rough number of the total output of goods and services in one calendar year. That's the GDP, right? Gross domestic product. For the United States these days, in the neighborhood of 26, 27 trillion dollars. What is the GDP of Russia right now? Between 3 and 4 trillion dollars. That's been the relationship. That's the relationship of an elephant and a mouse. Russia was never an economic threat or competitor. It was simply too small, too underdeveloped. It's a very large country by geography, but in terms of its economic, no. But that's not true of China. China, whose GDP, by the way, is around 18, 19 trillion dollars, not quite the US yet, but catching up fast, that's a wholly different story. That's not, you're not, going to fight a Cold War with China with the same results that you did that with Russia. It's a completely, and I don't think most Americans have got their heads around that yet. There's an awful lot of what my wife, who's a psychotherapist, calls denial. There's an awful lot here in the United States of people who, understandably, because I'm sure it happened in every other empire when it went down, there were a lot of people who pretended it didn't happen. I remember my last 2 or 3 trips to England. That's what I came away from.
Mm.
I talked to friends and associates of mine in Britain, people I like and respect and all of that, but there was still, even in the best of them, a leftover longing that would show up in odd moments of denial, of not understanding that Britain was now what it once was, a small, cold island off of the mainland of Europe. Even we, who are a product in some sense of the British Empire, probably have a hard time. And we don't see the humor that the only thing left of their empire are the coronations and the funerals of their kings and queens when they get out the pomp and circumstance and do their performance. But it's almost sad because everybody somewhere sees the dichotomy between all of that and the reality of the society. We are following in that process. And Mr. Trump, and by the way, this is not even a critique of Mr. Trump. I don't think any president would be in a position to reverse it. I think we could have a president who was a lot more honest about it,
Right.
talking to the people about it and trying to come up with a understood national conversation about how do you handle it. That would be adult. We don't have that. But I don't see that, all due respect, in the last presidential election, neither Mr. Biden nor Mr. Trump nor Kamala Harris spoke about a declining empire and what it means.
I don't. Yeah. Well, I think the
Denial.
American people don't really want to hear that. That's why the politicians don't really want to say anything about it.
Right.
And, it's funny you say that about the denial is something I've been talking about too, is like, I do think Trump in certain ways is stuck at his, sort of like pinnacle of fame, the early 90s, the late 80s. Like this is when he really comes into the cultural moment. And I see it when they're projecting things like, well, countries are going to have to choose between the US and China in this trade war. And it's like, well, who do you think that they're going to pick? There just seems to be such a misunderstanding of the relative power dynamics at this point that I can really only ascribe it to a very outdated model of, our power relationship vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. There was a speech he made, I believe, yesterday or the day before. And the clip that I saw has him say roughly the following. I think we're going to make a deal with the Chinese. They have to make a deal. And if they don't make a deal, well, then we'll make the deal. I will do it together with my Secretary of the Treasury and my advisor, Howard Lutnick, and so forth and so on. And we'll tell them, we'll be fair, but this image that you are going to dictate what happens and that your concept of fairness is some sort of absolute that everybody will recognize. That's a strange bet. Most adults realize that what I think is fair and what my adversaries or people around me think is fair are probably not identical, and that we're going to have to, in a marriage, in a friendship, in a business association, we have to, a deal is not imposed. Unless you have the power to do that. We don't. And you're right. It seems like a time warp has happened here. And these folks want to be in a place where they're not anymore. And the rest of the world looks at them, out of the corner of their eye and begins to wonder, Well, let me put in the words of a diplomat I know from Europe. Not a very high diplomat, but he's been doing that all his life. He said in a recent email, the United States is now, for all of us here, and then he mentions the European capital where he works, the United States has become the, I quote now, rogue nation.
Wow.
Remember the term that we've applied?
Mm-hmm.
That's how they can't get over. All they do all day long in their diplomatic place is try to figure out what Mr. Trump is going to do next, what they can rely on that he says, which is less and less, what changes with the hours, and they're very angry and very upset. Their lives have been upended, their plans have been upended. They're telling me that every business in Europe that's of any size and has any relations with the United States, it either buys from somebody in the United States or sells to somebody. Everybody is looking to quote unquote de-risk. And what de-risk means, lessen your dependence on the U.S. as a source for what you buy, lessen the United States as a market for what you sell, and don't rely on capital or borrowing. And that goes to what you just said. If you're forcing the world to pick, you're going to be really upset when you're going to see where they pick.
Yeah. Well, I just saw the news that Japan has come out and said, which of course, top ally, trading partner, et cetera, has come out and said, we're not going to be part of any trading bloc that seeks to isolate China because trade with Beijing is too important to us. Right. We see the European Parliament making moves to remove some sanctions on China and assign there, too, of additional thawing. So, I think Trump's comments this week that he doesn't want to keep the very high 145% or whatever the tariffs on China are at this point. It gets to a point where it really doesn't matter. 100, 200, 300 doesn't really matter, that he doesn't want to keep those on. But it seems like he's also looking for the Chinese government to give him some sort of face-saving gesture or some sort of capitulation that they don't seem particularly inclined to make.
No, their statements, I find them amazing, and the Chinese have been famous for many years in being, at least in public, who knows what they say amongst themselves in their meetings, but in public, very, very polite, very deferential, very correct and appropriate. They're now letting fly rude comments about the United States. And for me, I think that's quite symbolic of what you just said, that they don't feel they have to, and they now, I think, want to project what they are, which is a real alternative. And we cannot keep telling ourselves that that's not the case. Look, and I'm an economic historian. I teach that stuff in the university. China is the most impressive economic growth story in the history of the world. There's no way out of that. In 40 years, when I was a college student, we were given a book to read. I don't know if you ever got it, by an American woman, missionary named Pearl Buck. And she wrote a book, I believe the title, The Good Earth. Mm-hmm. And I believe it was about her experiences in China as an American missionary working in China. But what I left with, I couldn't tell you the plot of the novel, but the descriptions of China, I will never forget. The level, I had never imagined such poverty, and she was really very good at letting you feel and see what it meant to be a typically poor Chinese peasant. And to then see the pictures of China today, it is, and Americans have to understand, most of the world is poor. Most of the world has as one of its great priorities not being poor anymore, making the transition that Europe made, that North America made, to middle class status, whatever exactly you mean by it. That's what they want. And China did it. China is the new example. It did it in a shorter amount of time with more explosive modernity. I mean, they now match, what Apple does, what Intel, all our
Hmm.
great techno companies have their parallels coming out of China, and often now exceeding what we can do, at least in the moment. And we've never seen this before. This is a new reality for the United States. And I'm afraid that most of our politicians, I'll quote you back to you, since the people don't want to hear it, they're not going to tell them.
Yeah, that's right.
That doesn't make for good leadership.
What should people know about what China has done right and what has been so effective? I mean, when you look at the statistics, at the reduction in poverty
Yeah.
over an extremely short period of time, historically speaking, it is shocking. Like it is a world historic feat.
Yep.
And then when you couple that with the technological development, where by some metrics they've already surpassed us. I mean, it's a real question. We're sort of saying, okay, who's going to be the first and the leader in getting to AGI? Is it going to be the US? Is it going to be China?
Right.
It may be the case the real race is within China itself.
Yep.
Competition among different Chinese. They have so surpassed us in terms of EV battery and car technology that it's insane how far ahead they are in some of these areas. So what have been the key parts of their model that people should understand have been really successful?
I'm glad you asked. Let me try to explain. The Chinese, the power there is in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. They were the people who made the revolution back in the late 1940s. They won in 1949. Mao Zedong took over, and they've been running that country ever since. They had a support, very important, from the Soviet Union in their early years, no question. But they also split. This is where Americans don't follow the history. They split around the 1960s. China had a different idea of how to develop. The Russians had a different, still then the Soviet Union, and they went their separate ways, but the hostility and the bitterness between them was severe. They even had military clashes between Chinese troops and Russian Soviet troops on their border, which is a long border. So it has to be understood they have their own way of going for most of the last half century. Okay, what is the key difference between them? In Russia, the overwhelming majority of industrial enterprises were owned and operated by the government. The government took their definition of socialism, involved the government taking over, pushing the private out of the picture. You could have your own plot in agriculture, that stayed. You could have a little teeny business, you could do that on your own. But all the significant industry was government owned and operated. Okay? China did not do that. China made a decision to be a hybrid. What does that mean? Well, roughly half of the Chinese economy today is government owned and operated. You might say it's like the Soviet Union was. But the other half is private capitalist enterprises, both Chinese and foreign. They made the decision to welcome the Japanese, the Europeans, the Americans, the Canadians, and lots of businesses, for example, here in the United States, basically shut down their operations here and moved to China. Why did they do it? Particularly starting the 1970s, when this strategic approach of the Chinese was set by the then governments in China, and it has been pursued, by the way, ever since. This is a established regime, if you like, for their economy. Well, it had extraordinary effects. First, American businesses at first were not going to move to China. China is, a foreign country. It's a mysterious country. They don't speak English, blah, blah, blah. And so only the most courageous ones in America went initially when the Chinese invited them. Come here, you will be safe. We will respect your private property. You can do business here. They went, and they went for a very simple reason. The wages of Chinese workers were a small fraction of the wages of a comparable worker in the United States. And the second reason was that the Chinese market, let's remember, they have 4 times the population of the United States. Their market, because of their size, was not only big, but promising to get much bigger. Well, I've taught in American business schools. You teach young businessmen and women, you want to make a successful business, go to where the wages are low, and the market is growing. It's like, one and two. So a few courageous Americans went, and they made a fortune. And they were then able to outcompete the stodgier ones who weren't in a rush to go, who were more cautious, who were more hesitant. But then they, in order to survive competitively, had to go to China.
Mm-hmm.
They had to they could go to Vietnam or someplace else, maybe also. But China was the place to be, and China would be where you were close to others you needed to buy from or intermediaries. Long story short, nobody forced anyone to go to China. China didn't have the means or the mechanisms to make anybody move there. They had to offer something. And what they offered was a higher rate of profit than you can get in your home country. And what did the Chinese get? They got jobs for their people. They have a lot of people to get jobs for. And they demanded it. Technology sharing. They wanted to learn, because they were a catch-up society, what the United States technology or the Japanese technology or the European technology could. And so they said, you can come here, you can hire cheap Chinese workers, we will help you in every way, you can sell into the Chinese market, but you have to share your technology with us. And the Chinese made very good use of that deal. It's kind of, how do I say this politely? It's not quite nice, I'll leave it at that, to accuse them of stealing technology. They didn't. They didn't need to. They bought it. They bought it at a low price, namely, here you can hire our workers, here you can sell, which doesn't cost them very much, solves a lot of problems for them, and then to boot, they get the technology. That was a very nice deal, and they made good use of it. And by the way, they don't hide that. They don't pretend it was other than that. They know how much of a debt they have to Western capitalism. They don't want to say that's what made us have the great success. That's an American idea. That's not a Chinese idea. It's also not true. Yeah, you have to give credit where credit is due. What they were able to do is simply this.